It's basically an Australian pastime at this point to compare the country's two biggest cities of Sydney and Melbourne, although I personally think the two cities are much more similar than many would like to admit. In transport terms, one of the biggest differences between the cities has been that Sydney has its iconic ferry network, while Melbourne has its iconic trams. But even this difference is growing smaller, as in recent years Sydney has begun building out its own tram network. So could Melbourne do the same with ferries? Well, in the past, just like Sydney used to have quite an extensive tram network of its own, Melbourne used to have its own ferry network serving the Yarra River and Port Phillip Bay. But what made this network go away, and could Melbourne ever see ferries return as a major mode of transportation in the city? Well, in recent years there have been growing calls to establish a new ferry network in the city, one that could even extend as far out as the Mornington Peninsula. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at how Melbourne's ferry network used to work, what ferry routes still exist today, and what the city's network could look like in the future. Hi all, I'm City Moose, and I make videos about public transport and urbanism, mostly in Australia but also around the world, so consider subscribing if that sounds interesting to you. I also have a Ko-fi if you want to support the channel, I do always appreciate it. But now, back to Melbourne's hypothetical ferry network. Now, I shouldn't actually say hypothetical, the city already has a few ferry services currently in operation. And of course, historically, it had a pretty large network spanning the Yarra River and the Bay. Speaking of that historic network, on the Yarra, a lot of the ferries were punt services that simply worked to get traffic from one side of the river to the other before bridges were built. The major arterial road in the city's inner east, Punt Road, gets its name from the fact that it used to lead to a punt crossing before a bridge was built fully connecting it. That said, the Yarra did have some non-punt ferry services as well. There was a service that ran from Princess Bridge to Cremorne, as well as another that ran from the city to Williamstown at Gem Pier. In the case of both of these services, however, railway lines were eventually built to these areas and these outcompeted the ferry services. There were also ferries that ran beyond the river and out into the bay to a long list of destinations including Geelong, Port Arlington, Sorrento, Dromana, Queenscliff and Mornington. These services were run with paddle steamer ferries, which were pretty slow, and again, when railways were built to Geelong, Queenscliff and Mornington, the ferries weren't able to compete with them. Although it is worth noting the railway lines to Mornington and Queenscliff have since closed, leaving the areas now reliant on buses. But despite losing all these ferry services, Melbourne's geography is still somewhat suited to ferries. The city is located on a navigable river which opens onto the pretty calm waters of Port Phillip Bay. Other bay-based cities, like San Francisco, take advantage of their bay's protected waters to operate a decent-sized ferry system. Even river-based cities, such as Brisbane, are still able to operate somewhat useful ferry networks. So, is it time Melbourne took advantage of its geography and set one up? Well, currently the city actually already has a very limited set of ferry services. These are all operated privately and independently from one another, but they are all overseen by PTV. The first one, and what is the last remaining regular commuter ferry in Melbourne, is the Westgate Punt. Like the punt services of the past that I mentioned, this ferry is also just used to transport people from one bank of the Yarra to the other, connecting Fisherman's Bend with Spotswood. Before the Westgate Bridge was built, the only option to travel from one side of the lower reaches of the river to the other was to take a car ferry. But this service became redundant when the bridge was completed in 1978. However, the bridge was only built to carry cars and provides no options for pedestrians or cyclists. As a result, in the 90s, the Westgate Punt was introduced, finally giving these pedestrians and cyclists a way to cross this part of the Yarra River. Now, the other ferry services running from Melbourne cover distances that are a bit longer than the Westgate Punt. These services run out of Docklands and are operated by Port Phillip Ferries. Currently, they have two services operating, one from Docklands to Port Arlington taking about an hour and 10 minutes, and a second from Docklands to Geelong taking about an hour and a half. Both services operate twice a day in both directions, once in the morning and once in the evening, making it a reasonably good service for people wanting to day trip or holiday to these destinations. Some people even use them for regular commuting, although with their low frequencies and long journey times, I don't think they're ideally set up for that. If you want to commute from Geelong in particular, there is already a railway service that is both faster and a lot more frequent than the ferry, not to mention a fair bit cheaper. So the Geelong route really only makes sense as a more scenic touristy option. On the other hand, because Portarlington doesn't currently have a rail connection, that route is useful for more reasons other than just being scenic. In fact, the ferry is actually the fastest way to get from Melbourne CBD to Portarlington, being quicker than both driving and other public transport options. As a result, since this ferry route began operating in 2016, it has proven to be quite popular, and has even been credited as a major factor behind Portarlington's recent growth and success. So it's not surprising that earlier this year, the Victorian state government committed to funding the service for another 4 years. But back on the topic of existing ferry services in and around Melbourne, there are 3 more worth mentioning. Those being the Western Port Ferry that connects Stony Point with French and Phillip Islands, the Queenscliff to Sorrento car ferry that lets cars cross between the Mornington and Bellarine peninsulas, and of course the Spirit of Tasmania that runs across the Bass Strait from Geelong to Devonport. Those 3 don't, however, run into metropolitan Melbourne, so I'm not really going to be focusing on them. That said, given the success of the Portarlington ferry, as well as the geography that's pretty well suited to ferries, could Melbourne start to see new ferry routes taking off? Well, while the geography is somewhat suited for ferries, it's not without some challenges. Firstly, if you want to run ferries on the Yarra, you'll have to deal with a lot of low bridges, and the river is only really navigable up to Dights Falls, which isn't even that far away from the city centre. Also, the areas between Dights Falls and the city are already served by trains and trams, so a ferry wouldn't really be adding much. Heading downstream from the city, you have areas like Fisherman's Bend, which doesn't currently have any trains or trams, so a ferry could be useful as there are plans to densify that area. But there are also plans to add train and tram connections as part of this densification, which again would probably provide a more convenient service than a ferry could. The issue of areas already being served by high-quality train and tram services, which is not really a bad issue to have, applies beyond the river as well to much of the bay. Bayside suburbs to the south of the city are already well served by trams. The suburbs to the east are well served by the Sandringham and Frankston train lines, and on the west they're well served by the Williamstown and Werribee lines. The only real exceptions to this are the suburbs of Beaumaris on the east and Werribee South and Point Cook in the west, which are all currently reliant on some fairly mediocre bus routes. Now, there has actually been an attempt to establish a ferry to Werribee South. This attempt was made in 2016 by Port Phillip Ferries, the guys behind the Geelong and Portarlington ferry routes. Their plan was to run a more commuter-focused service between Wyndham Harbour in Werribee South and their main ferry terminal in Docklands. They were using catamarans with a capacity of around 400 people, and ran one trip each morning from Wyndham Harbour to Docklands, and then a return trip in the evening, so clearly focusing on the 9 to 5 commuter market. These commuters, however, did not show up, and the service was quite quickly canned. But why didn't this ferry route work? Well, one clear reason is that there aren't currently a whole lot of people living in the Wyndham Harbour precinct at the moment. In fact, the entire suburb of Werribee South is only home to just over 2,000 people, many of whom don't live near Wyndham Harbour. So I could imagine the service being used more if more people lived there, which may happen as the area continues to develop. There's also the fact that the ticket costs were pretty expensive, costing around $20 for a return ticket, which would add up quickly if you were a regular commuter. And of course, frequency was very low, with only one service running in each direction each day. On top of all of that, the journey times were pretty long as well, taking around 80 minutes to make the trip in each direction, which might be fine for a tourist service, but gets pretty long if you're doing that as a commute each day. One of the factors behind this slow speed was the speed limits in the Yarra River. Because the lower parts of the Yarra River are also a major port with lots of cargo ships, boats aren't allowed to go that fast. When creating the Wyndham Harbour route, Port Phillip Ferries did try to get those speed limits raised, as it was estimated that with faster speeds the trip times could have been a lot shorter, but that didn't happen. One idea that was raised to get speed limits higher was to run the ferries to Station Pier instead of Docklands to avoid the low speed limits in the Yarra. But this would have required passengers to change for the 109 tram to complete their journey into the city. In my view, the loss of this potential ferry route is a bit of a pity, in part just because I think it would be kind of cool if Melbourne had a commuter ferry network, but also in part because Werribee South is pretty lacking for good public transportation options. If the area were to densify more, get some feeder bus routes, and if the ferry travel times and frequencies could be improved, I could see the ferry becoming a somewhat useful commuter service. But where I personally think ferries could really find success in Melbourne is beyond just the 9 to 5 commuter crowd. If we look at ferries that have achieved success, namely the Port Arlington ferry, it's at its most successful on the weekends with the tourist crowds. And while yes, it does attract some 9 to 5 commuters during the week, loads more people from Melbourne and abroad use it on the weekends to make easy trips down to the Bellarine Peninsula without needing a car. The Bellarine and Mornington Peninsulas are both popular destinations for Melburnians looking to escape the city for day trips, long weekends and other short holidays. But they can be a pain to get to without a car. If you want to get to either by public transport, you'll probably find yourself having to get a train to either Geelong or Frankston, and then changing for a very slow bus service. This wouldn't have to be the case if ferry routes were set up connecting to these peninsulas. Many of the old historic ferry routes from Melbourne could be reopened, such as to Mornington, Sorrento and Queenscliff. So people who don't have a car, or people that do but would rather take a scenic ride along the water as opposed to just staring at a motorway, could have a better way of getting to these popular destinations. And the CEO of Port Phillip Ferries has indicated that he is interested in adding new ferry services beyond just the western side of Port Phillip Bay, including potentially to Mornington, which he specifically called out. The company also recently invested in an upgraded ferry terminal in Docklands, which was completed in 2022. That said, the CEO's comments were made a little while ago, and there aren't any concrete announcements that these new services will actually be added just yet. But in my view, they could be good additions. As people who advocate for public transport, we often tend to focus on transport within cities because, to be fair, that is where the vast majority of journeys are made. But people do like to leave cities sometimes too, and when they do, they often find themselves needing a car. Using ferries to support journeys like day trips or weekends away with public transport can further reduce people's reliance on cars, while also encouraging those that do need them to drive less and use the more environmentally friendly public transport options. Well, as always, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. I'd also be interested to hear your opinions on whether ferries could work in Melbourne, so drop a comment below if you have any thoughts. If you want to support the channel, there'll be a link to my Ko-fi on screen, and of course, I'm Kyle, aka City Moose, and thanks for watching.